Imagine a teacher who one day makes a choice that turns her life upside down. Anna couldn't turn a blind eye to what was happening to her student. A withdrawn girl named Lisa whose bruises on her arms spoke more than all words could say. And when the system set up to protect children failed again, Anna took the crazy step of refusing to return the child to her mother, knowing that devastating consequences would follow. But how far can you go to protect someone in need? When justice is turned away, there's only one thing left to do. Act on your own. Lisa is gone, and with her, hope is gone, but not for Anna. This story is about one woman defying the system, fighting for a child's life, risking her career, her reputation, and even her freedom.
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes, dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
When I first started as a teacher, I was full of energy and ideals. My childhood was spent in a large family where love and care were a priority, and I always felt that all children should grow up in a similar environment. I entered the Faculty of Pedagogy with one single goal: to help children become better, stronger, more self-confident. But gradually I realized that school is not only about learning math or reading. School is a place where children can seek refuge when their world falls apart. I was sure of one thing. If a child is unhappy at home, it is the school that should become a second home for him, where he can feel safe. This principle has always led me forward, helped me to make difficult decisions. But no one prepares you for the fact that one day, you will have to face a story that will turn your whole life upside down. It all started when a new student, Lisa, came to my class. She was only 7 years old, but she had a sadness in her eyes that not every adult could bear. She was quiet, withdrawn, always walking with her head down. This immediately attracted my attention, because children at her age are usually full of energy, joy, noisy, arguing, playing. But Lisa, it was as if she was not part of this world. I tried from the very beginning to find an approach to her, but she avoided socializing with me and with other children. I remember her first day of school. She came in quietly, without raising her eyes. Her clothes were not new but neat, though something about her appearance was unsettling. Maybe it was her gait, slow, cautious, as if she was afraid of every step, or her hands, which were constantly rubbing something, either the corner of her backpack or the edge of her sweater. It was like a sign: don't come near me, don't touch me. I decided to observe, to take my time, giving her time to settle in. But after a couple of weeks, I noticed that her behavior didn't change. On the contrary, she became more and more withdrawn, less and less socialized with her classmates. The kids in the class, of course, began to notice her oddities, but they had not yet managed to turn into little monsters who usually tease those who are different from the others. I, on the other hand, as a teacher, couldn't ignore her condition. One of the first warning signs were the bruises I noticed on her arms and legs. At first I thought it was just the result of play. Children often fall, run around, and bruise themselves. But something about these bruises alerted me. They weren't just on her knees or elbows, where active kids usually get abrasions, but all along the length of her arms and legs. These didn't look like normal bruises. I tried to gently ask Lisa what had happened. She said she had fallen. I took that as the truth. At that point, I didn't know yet that this was the first signal that her life at home was a living hell. After another week, I noticed that Lisa started coming to school wearing the same clothes several days in a row. At first it didn't raise much suspicion. Maybe the family wasn't well off, it happens. But then the clothes started to look more and more unkempt. On the third day in a row, when she showed up in the same dress, I felt uncomfortable. I decided to talk to her more seriously after school. That day I stayed in class longer than usual, purposely waiting until Lisa was alone. She was packing her things silently as usual, slowly, in no hurry to go home. I walked over to her, sat down next to her and said in a quiet voice, "Lisa, is everything okay? You look tired. You can tell me if something is wrong." She continued to be quiet. I didn't want to push, but I needed to understand what was going on with her. I decided to try again, only this time differently. I told her a little story from my childhood, how I myself was once afraid to come home when I got D's. You know, Lisa, sometimes we're afraid to tell the truth to adults because we think we won't be understood. But I'm here to listen to you. You can trust me. And that's when she burst into tears. It was unexpected. She was sitting next to me, quiet, reserved, and suddenly her tears came pouring out as if someone had opened a faucet. She cried for a long time loudly, without holding back her emotions. I tried to calm her down, but at that moment I realized it was not just fear of the test work or anger of parents for bad grades. It was something much bigger. She wasn't just crying because of today. She was crying for everything she had been through for months or even years. When she was finally able to speak, her words shook me to the core. Lisa told me that at home she is punished for the slightest misbehavior. She is locked in a dark room at night, deprived of food if she misbehaves. She's also beaten. Those words sounded like a sentence. My little Lisa was living in hell, and no one but she knew it. I was in shock. My first thought was to call child services. But then came the realization that it might not make a difference. How many times had I heard stories of children who, despite reporting abuse, were returned back to their families where they continued to suffer? Lisa had entrusted me with her secret, and I couldn't just hand her back to the hell she came from. So I made a decision. When Lisa's mother came to the school to pick her up, I refused. I explained to the mother that the girl could not come home until I dealt with the situation. The mother was furious. She yelled at me, threatened to sue me. But I stood my ground. I called the police, locked myself and Lisa in the classroom and waited for justice to intervene. The next day, I was summoned to the principal's office. The principal didn't bother to be polite. I walked into his office and he immediately started talking. His face was serious, and there was no hint of understanding or sympathy in his voice. To him, I was just an employee who had broken the rules. Anna, do you realize that your behavior is not only against school rules, but also in violation of the law? You had no right to hold a child against the will of the parents. He began without raising his eyes from the papers on the desk. I realized I had broken the rules, but what would any person with a heart do in my shoes? I knew Lisa couldn't go back to that house. Her mother looked aggressive, and her threats sounded like there was a lot more behind them than just words. But what could I do within a system that was failing itself? Lisa told me everything. Do you realize she's being beaten at home? How could I just let her go? I tried to explain, but I knew it wouldn't work. The system isn't built on morals. It's built on laws, and laws often don't work the way they should. The principal sighed and set the papers aside. Anna, I realize you acted in good faith, but we have to follow procedure in situations like this. You had no right to hold the child. You should have gone to the child welfare authorities instead of handling things on your own. I knew there was some truth in what he said, but I also knew that if I had just called child welfare, Lisa could have been sent back home. And that was a risk I couldn't afford. Well, I'm sorry, but we can no longer allow you to work at our school, he said after a pause. The principal's words sounded like a sentence. It was like I stopped breathing for a second. What do you mean I can't work at the school anymore? Everything I'd worked for all these years, my whole career, all the effort I put into my students, could end like this? Because I decided to protect a child? I stared at the principal, unable to utter a word. He looked confident and cold. To him it was just another day at work, another decision to make. To me it was more than that. It was my life. But how could I explain that to someone who hadn't seen and felt what I experienced when I heard Lisa's story? Anna, I realize this is a hard decision. But you must understand that we cannot allow a teacher to take such action without consulting the authorities. We operate within the system, and unfortunately you have broken it, he said, as if he was trying to comfort me. But those words brought no comfort. They only made things worse. I left the principal's office with a heavy heart. I was fired. I'd been robbed of something I loved. But what pained me the most was that I couldn't help Lisa. What would happen to her now? I did everything I could, but despite my efforts, she was taken home again. Home to the place she feared the most. As I walked down the hallway, looking at the empty walls of the school, everything seemed somehow unreal. This building that had always been a second home to me was now foreign and hostile. The children I loved, who looked up to me with trust and respect, would no longer see me at the blackboard. Everything I had created over the years now seemed destroyed. But the worst part was that I couldn't get rid of the image of Lisa. Her crying face, her fear, her despair. I felt that I had betrayed her, that I had failed to fulfill my promise to protect her. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Lisa's mother had taken her away, and I could only imagine what went on behind the closed doors of their home. I was escorted out of the school, and the girl went back to her tormentors. I wanted to scream, but no one would hear my voice. The system I had so much faith in was broken, and I no longer knew how to fight this injustice. I remember coming home that day. Everything around me seemed empty and meaningless. I sat on the couch looking out the window, but there was only one thing on my mind: what would happen to Lisa? I tried to call the guardianship authorities to find out how the case was progressing, but they told me that no decisions had been made yet. They said that the review could take a few weeks, and that they would monitor the situation. It was the standard response they probably responded to hundreds of other people with. But I knew it wasn't enough. A week went by. I tried to distract myself to get another job, but thoughts of Lisa never left me. In the back of my mind, I felt that something was wrong with her. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was just worrying too much, that maybe things would get better. But it was self-deception. One evening, as I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, the phone rang. It was one of my former colleagues from school. His voice was strained and anxious. "Anna, did you hear?" he said. "About what?" My heart sank. "Lisa is missing. Her mother says she went for a walk and never came home." Those words pierced me like a knife. Missing? Lisa disappeared. It couldn't be true. I grabbed my phone, not believing my ears. How did this happen? When? Last night. The police have already started a search, but no sign of him yet, the coworker continued. My head rattled. I couldn't believe it had happened. Just a few days ago I had seen her, talked to her, and now she had just disappeared? My first inclination was to rush outside, to start looking for her myself, to shout her name in the hope that she would respond. But I knew it was useless. I felt as if the world had collapsed around me. All my fears, all my suspicions were real. Hours passed, but I couldn't find my place. I tried to call the police, the child welfare authorities, the school, anywhere to find out any details, but no one could give me a clear answer. Everyone kept saying the same thing. "We're investigating." A few days later, as the search for Lisa continued, I learned that her stepfather had been questioned by the police. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from their house the night the girl disappeared. It was another alarming signal that confirmed my worst fears. But so far, the police couldn't officially confirm his involvement. I walked around my apartment as if in a fog, unable to find my place. My guilt grew stronger and stronger. I felt that I could have done more, that if I had done something differently that day, things could have turned out differently. Lisa had trusted me and I couldn't save her. It was a few more days later when I learned that the police had found the doll in the woods just outside of town. It was the same doll I had seen Lisa holding. It was like a signal that she was trying to escape. But what happened next? Why couldn't she escape? And worst of all, why hadn't anyone stopped her before? These questions were burning me from the inside out. I felt completely helpless in the face of this situation. But I knew I couldn't just let it go. When I found out about the doll found in the forest, it was like something clicked in my head. That doll was the last thread linking Lisa to the world she was trying to survive in. I imagined how she might have held it in her hands on the last night when everything went wrong. But what exactly happened that day remained a mystery. The police remained silent, and all the information I received came through rumors, neighbors, and those who knew Lisa's family. That night I couldn't sleep. All sorts of possibilities were running through my mind. What if she tried to run away but someone stopped her? What if she got lost? Or maybe someone had found her and... No, I couldn't even think about that. I tried to cling to the slightest hope that Lisa was still alive, that she had somehow miraculously managed to get out of this hell and escape. But the more time passed, the more I realized that the chances of a happy outcome were getting slimmer and slimmer. I contacted former colleagues from the school, trying to find out how the other kids had reacted to Lisa's disappearance. Some of them said that students began to speculate, whispering at recess, discussing what had happened to their classmate. They were afraid Lisa would never come back. But they didn't know the whole truth, didn't know the darkness that surrounded her home. And that knowledge tore me up inside. Another week passed. The police were still silent. I began to feel that time was working against us. In situations like this, every minute is worth its weight in gold. and the days that went by without news were killing me mentally. I couldn't sit back and just wait, so I decided to take action. My first thought was to contact journalists. They could cover the situation, draw more attention to Lisa's case, make the police and guardianship authorities more active. I realized that official structures may keep quiet about such cases, trying not to raise a fuss, especially if there are suspicions that one of the adults has already been on the radar of the police or guardianship authorities. I contacted a journalist from a local publication who had previously written articles on child abuse. We agreed to meet at a cafe near my home. When he came, I immediately felt that I had found an ally. He was a man who cared about other people's pain, and his stories about other similar cases confirmed my feeling that I was doing the right thing. "Anna, these stories happen more often than we realize," he said, taking a sip of coffee. "But the key here is not to give up. If you want to bring attention to Lisa's case, you're going to have to fight to the end. The local authorities may try to silence the case so as not to raise a scandal, but if we get the federal media involved, it will be harder to silence the truth." From what he said, it was clear to me that it wasn't going to be easy, but I had no other choice. If Lisa never came back, at least the truth about what happened to her should be heard. Maybe it would help other kids who are in similar situations. I told him everything I knew, showed him pictures of Lisa, mentioned the doll I had found and my suspicions about her stepfather. The journalist listened attentively and wrote everything down in his notebook. "I'll write an article. We'll publish it next week," he said. "And from there it will depend on how much public reaction there is." I knew the case was now headed in the right direction, but I also realized that journalists might not be immediately successful. Sometimes the public's attention is focused on these stories only for a moment, and then quickly shifts to something else. My job was not to let the story get lost among other news stories. A few days later, the article came out. It contained everything. Details of Lisa's life, her condition at school, my suspicions, the doll found, and even quotes from neighbors who had long noticed something wrong but were afraid to talk about it openly. This publication became a bombshell in our small town. People started discussing it at work, in stores, on the streets. But most importantly, the situation was finally noticed at a higher level. The publication of the article caused a wave of comments on social networks. People were outraged at how this could have happened, asking why the guardianship authorities had not intervened earlier. Several major news outlets picked up the story, and this led to Lisa's case beginning to take on a national scale. I remember the first time I saw the report on television. The anchor talked about how Lisa's case had become a symbol of how our country's child protection system was failing. From the screens there were calls for reforms, for more control over guardianship agencies and human rights organizations. Although it didn't bring Lisa back, I felt that everything I was doing was finally starting to make sense. However, there were still many obstacles in the way. The police were slow to share the results of the investigation. Despite public pressure, they maintained their stance. "We are investigating but cannot comment on the situation at this time." This did not sit well with me. I knew that the longer they delayed, the more likely it was that they might try to hush up the case. I continued to communicate with journalists, human rights activists, and other activists who began to support my campaign for justice for Lisa. We organized rallies in front of the police and care authorities, demanding openness and a fair investigation. More and more people joined us, and soon these rallies began to attract the attention of even those who normally would not pay attention to such cases. But despite our best efforts, weeks went by and Lisa was still missing. It was agonizing. A sense of despair grew inside me. What if I hadn't done enough? What if we were too late? These questions plagued me day and night. One evening, when I had almost given up, I received a phone call from the same journalist I had first met in the cafe. His voice sounded excited. "Anna, I have news for you. It concerns Lisa's stepfather. I've gotten insider information that he's about to be arrested. They have evidence of his involvement in the girl's disappearance." Those words sounded like thunder to me. It was the moment I had been waiting for. Finally, the police had found evidence. It means that the case is moving forward, and that justice will catch up with the perpetrators after all. The journalist told me that it's about serious evidence that was found in the stepfather's car. What exactly this evidence is, he didn't know yet, but he said that Lisa's case could soon get a new twist. The news that the police had evidence against Lisa's stepfather filled me with a mixture of relief and anxiety. On the one hand, I felt that the truth was finally coming out, that my struggle had not been in vain. On the other hand, it was all happening too slowly. The days were passing, and Lisa was still missing. And that was tearing me apart. I knew that even if my stepfather was arrested, it might not matter to Lisa anymore. Over the next week, the police really got active. They arrested Lisa's stepfather and announced that they would begin a new interrogation investigation. Journalists picked up the news, and our city was plunged into an even greater wave of discussion and suspicion. People who knew the family shared their stories of how they had long suspected something fishy was going on behind the closed doors of their home. But no one had the courage to come forward before. I kept thinking that this was yet another example of how public silence breeds tragedies. Neighbors heard the screaming, saw Lisa walking around with bruises, but no one wanted to intervene. Perhaps they were afraid, perhaps they did not want to get involved in someone else's business. And now that fear was costing an innocent girl her life. When I spoke to the journalist who was following the case once again, he told me that Lisa's case was getting more and more complicated. Although the stepfather had been arrested, there was no concrete evidence yet that he was the one who had committed the abuse or led to her disappearance. Police have been looking for clues, but so far everything has remained at the level of conjecture and suspicion. We can only hope they find something, he said, sighing heavily. But, Anna, you must be prepared for the truth to be far darker than you realize. These words plunged me into more anxiety. I felt like each new day only brought more questions than answers. Every time I tried to come to terms with the fact that Lisa might never come back, my heart broke with pain. I thought about how in my profession I had always tried to protect children, but Lisa was the one I couldn't save. Meanwhile, my campaign to draw attention to Lisa's story was gaining momentum. Social media was full of comments and posts about what should be done to protect children, about the need for reforms in child welfare agencies, about how important the role of teachers is in the lives of students. I had a lot of people supporting me, but I knew that this was just the beginning. Society started to talk about the problem, but that did not solve it. I met with human rights organizations, took part in roundtables to discuss reforms to the child protection system. We pushed to start checking the work of the guardianship authorities in our district to find out why they did not react to the signals about Lisa's dysfunctional family. But these processes were slow and exhausting. The bureaucracy resisted any change, and every step forward seemed like a victory with a bitter aftertaste. Despite the public outcry, the police were still unable to find Lisa. And that was the hardest challenge for all of us. We knew the truth could be horrible, but we couldn't give up. I kept making posts, giving interviews, participating in rallies, because it was the only way to get the authorities to act faster. One night, as I sat at my computer looking at articles about other similar cases of child abuse, I received a message from a woman. She said that she lived near Lisa's family and had known about the problems in their home for a long time, but was afraid to say anything. She told me that she had seen Lisa try to escape from the house several times, but she had been brought back. She wrote to me that she felt guilty for not intervening sooner, and now wanted to help. The message was like a reminder that everyone can play a part in saving someone else's life, but sometimes fear and indifference prevent us from doing so. I read her message several times and realized that for many, this is a story not just about Lisa, but about themselves, about their fears, their mistakes, their understatements. So I decided to use this as a new outlet. We started collecting stories of other people who had faced similar situations. I started posting these stories on social media, adding a call to action. Don't be silent, I wrote under each post. If you see a child suffering, it is your responsibility to intervene. Don't wait until it's too late. These posts began to gain popularity. More and more people shared their experiences, telling of instances where they felt guilty for not intervening in time. I realized that this campaign was more than just a fight for Lisa. It was a fight for all those children who had gone unnoticed. A few weeks had passed when I received a call from the journalist again. This time his voice was serious, but not as strained as before. He said the police had new evidence. They had found traces of Lisa in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, not far from the woods where her doll had been found. It was an important step forward, but still not a definitive answer. The reporter said that police are now certain that Lisa was held by force. But who had done it and why remained a mystery. At that point, it had already become clear that the stepfather may not have been the only person involved in the story. There were suspicions that other people, perhaps family acquaintances, were involved. This information was like a blow to the head. Had Lisa been the victim of more than just abuse but something worse? I tried to make sense of it all, but a storm was raging inside me. I couldn't believe it had gotten this far. The police promised to continue their search and bring federal agencies into the case. It was a sign that Lisa's case was no longer being hushed up, that justice was being served. But it didn't bring me relief. I still felt like I hadn't done enough, that I could have prevented her disappearance if I had done things differently. Meanwhile, my campaign continued to grow. People across the country began organizing in support of abuse victims, demanding reforms in the child protection system. I saw that our society was ready to change, ready to protect its most vulnerable citizens. But this was only the beginning of a long journey. After the journalist's call, when I learned of the discovery in the abandoned house, I was overcome with a feeling of anxiety and relief at the same time. On the one hand, it was an important step forward. The police had finally started to move, they had found traces of Lisa, and I felt that the case was finally gaining momentum. On the other hand, it made the picture even more confusing. If she was being held by force, then the story was much more complicated and dark than I had imagined. I couldn't sit idly by. Each day of waiting stretched like an eternity. I dug deeper and deeper into my investigation, talking to human rights activists and journalists, gathering information from anyone who might have had any involvement or knowledge of what was happening at Lisa's house. I felt like I was beginning to breathe this story, to sink deeper and deeper into it. It became my new life. My social media campaign continued to gain popularity. People started organizing their own initiatives, demanding stricter control over the guardianship authorities. Lisa's story became a catalyst, launching a wave of public outrage. It seemed like every day I received messages from people sharing their stories or expressing support. I was supported by mothers, teachers, social workers, people who, like me, were convinced that children needed to be protected and the system needed to work better. But despite all efforts, Lisa was never found. The journalist and I kept in touch, and one day he broke the news to me that seemed to be the answer I feared most. "Anna, there are reports that Lisa may have been taken out of town," he said. Those words were like a hammer blow to me. If it was true, the chances of finding her were getting slimmer and slimmer. The police suspected that the case might be related to child trafficking. It was the worst thing I could imagine, and it put everything in a whole new context. I realized that it wasn't just justice at stake anymore, but Lisa's very life. My mind was spinning with thoughts of what I should do next. My first reaction was panic. How was it possible that Lisa had been taken away without anyone noticing? How could I have let this happen? But I quickly realized that what was most important now was to focus on action. The police promised to intensify the search, and federal agencies got on the case. But it was all too slow for me. At times like this, every minute is worth its weight in gold, and I felt like I was wasting time sitting and watching from the sidelines. I decided to expand my campaign. I started publishing posts about child trafficking cases, bringing attention to the issue. I was supported by several major human rights organizations, and we launched a campaign with a hashtag that quickly gained popularity. People started sharing stories about how their children were at risk, how they faced the indifference of the system when they tried to protect their loved ones. It all became another step forward. But I still couldn't shake the feeling of powerlessness. Every day that Lisa remained missing was like a knife in my heart. I woke up thinking I could have done more. I went to bed feeling guilty that I may not have taken every possible action when I needed to. Another week passed. The police continued to investigate, but all they could say was that Lisa had most likely been taken out of town to one of the nearby areas. This made the search even more difficult because now Lisa could be anywhere. This uncertainty, this fear of the unknown was eating me up inside. Meanwhile, my life had changed beyond recognition. I could no longer return to the usual work of a teacher, because all my thoughts were occupied with Lisa and her fate. I became an activist, a person who fights for those who cannot defend themselves. It was my way of redemption, my way of drowning out at least some of the guilt. At one of the rallies we organized together with human rights organizations, a woman came up to me holding a photograph. She said that her son had also disappeared a few years ago, and she still didn't know where he was. I saw in her eyes the same pain I was feeling myself. She told me that the police refused to seriously consider his case, writing it off as a runaway. But she was sure her son had been a victim of violence. Her story made me wonder, how many other children could have been in the same situation as Lisa? How many have been lost because adults simply weren't paying attention or didn't want to intervene? It was a frightening thought, but it became another motivation for me to keep fighting. Over the next few months I kept fighting. But the longer the search went on, the less hopeful I became. Lisa was never found. The police stopped actively investigating, and I was left alone with the thought that I might never know what had happened to her. My campaign was still active. I didn't give up, even though my strength was beginning to leave me. Sometimes I thought I had lost the meaning of life, that my fight for Lisa was slowly turning into a fight for something abstract. But every time I received a new message from someone thanking me for my work, for what I had done, I realized that I had to keep going. After all those terrible weeks, when it seemed like there was no hope left, I received a message that changed everything. It was the same journalist we had worked with from the beginning. His message was short, but so incredible that I didn't immediately believe what I was reading. Anna, Lisa has been found. She's alive. I froze, staring at the screen of my phone. My first reaction was shock. I read the message again. Lisa is alive. Alive. Tears instantly came to my eyes, but they were tears of joy, tears of relief that I had been unable to experience for so long. As soon as the realization of this miraculous fact began to reach me, I called the reporter. What? Where is she? What happened? I asked the questions almost in one breath. He sighed, but there was relief in his voice. Lisa was found in another city. She was being held at the home of a stepfather she knew. It's a miracle she was found before anything happened. Police began monitoring that house after new evidence came out, and they released Lisa yesterday. The world took on color again. What had seemed like a dystopian nightmare had suddenly turned out to be a miracle. Lisa was safe. I listened to his story of how the police had finally gotten on the trail, that her stepfather and her mother had been arrested and charged with child abuse offenses. I could barely contain my emotions, but in that moment I allowed myself to believe in the best again. The reporter told me that Lisa had been taken into protective custody and was now being treated by professionals. Her parents would no longer be able to hurt her anymore. At that moment, all I wanted was to see Lisa, to see for myself that she was okay. A few days passed and I was allowed to meet Lisa. I arrived at the center where she was temporarily housed, nervous and excited at the same time that the day had come. I saw her sitting on a bench in the garden, and the first thing that caught my eye was her smile. The same girl I remembered as so scared and closed off was now looking at the world with a new timid hope. I approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. But when she noticed me, her eyes lit up and she jumped up from the bench to hug me. I hugged her tightly, feeling some new calmness pass through her embrace. "I'm so glad you're okay, Lisa," I said, unable to hold back the tears. She just nodded, squeezing my hands. We didn't need to say much. We both knew what this moment meant to both of us. I looked at this little girl and realized that everything I had been through was not in vain. We sat together for a long time, talking about how she was feeling, how she had been rescued, and what was next for her. Lisa was still a little scared, but in her eyes I could see glimmers of hope, the same hope I had been trying to keep alive for so long. Later, I was told that both Lisa's mother and stepfather had been arrested and convicted. The trial was swift because of the overwhelming evidence against them, evidence of abuse, neglect, and attempting to place a child in the hands of dangerous people. They were convicted and now they would not be able to harm Lisa. Lisa was placed with a new safe family who willingly took over her care. She was now being monitored by social services to make sure she never again found herself in a situation like the one she had been through. Lisa began seeing a psychologist, and although her wounds were deep, she now had a chance at a normal, happy life. For me, this moment was the culmination of my entire struggle. I watched as Lisa began to come to life, as positive changes began to happen in her life, and that was the best reward for me. She was saved, and it meant that everything I had done, all the effort in fighting for justice, had led to the right result. Lisa's story inspired a lot of people. My campaign continued to grow, but now it took on a different character. It wasn't just a fight for reform. It became a symbol of hope. Hope that even in the most desperate of situations, there is a way out, a way to save those in need. People began to share their stories of how they saved children from dysfunctional families, how they intervened in the lives of those who were on the brink. We started creating new programs to help children, launching initiatives to support families and work with social services. My life changed forever. I was no longer just a teacher. I became a child advocate, an activist who dedicated her life to making sure that stories like Lisa's would not be repeated. I knew there was more work to be done, but now I had a purpose that I lived by. Every time I met Lisa, I saw her growing in confidence. Her new foster parents surrounded her with love and care. She started at her new school, made friends again, and learned to enjoy life again. And it was the best outcome I could have dreamed of. In the end, this story is not about defeat but about victory. About the triumph of good over evil. About how one little child was able to find a new life through the efforts of so many people who didn't leave her in the lurch. And every time I think of Lisa, I know that even in the darkest of times, there is room for light. We can fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, and in the end we can win.